This lecture is on doing business globally. I'm going to focus on foreign direct investment, looking at the selection of the investment vehicle. This will be the last of the video lectures. Well, when we decide that we're going to do business globally, that means have some kind of a presence overseas or in some foreign country. We have to choose the form to carry out the foreign investment. We have several possibilities, going from the least or the most cost efficient and the least problematic to the most problematic. The first is the representative office using an agent, then the branch operations, wholly owned subsidiaries, and then joint ventures with someone, some citizen of that foreign country. How do we get investment into this foreign country for our business venture? Well, we have two types of investments that we can make. We can use foreign direct investment, and this is an overseas investment in productive assets in one country by a firm established in another. For example, we would put someone or assets over in there, whether it's through a subsidiary, a joint venture, or branch operations. Another thing that we can do is we can simply invest overseas through portfolio or passive investment. Now, this is generally not the way that you would do business overseas, but it is a foreign investment. The risk involved in when you make portfolio or passive investments, well, for example, if you were investing in a Chinese venture that had a 22% rate of return, the risk that would be involved would be credit risk, the currency convertibility risk, meaning the inability to convert the earnings in foreign currency into U.S. dollars, a repatriation risk. There may be limitations on repatriating the currency, the foreign currency, into the U.S. Exchange rate risk. On any time that you're dealing with foreign currency, there may be fluctuations in the exchange rate. They can go up or go down. And then there are special tax rules for dividends and capital flows, generally within the U.S., other than the rules from Subchapter F of Chapter C of the Internal Revenue Code dealing with corporations. These foreign-controlled corporations are given tax preference. Keep in mind, however, that the dividends that are returned are not given the preference. In the U.S., there can be reduced tax rates, even down to zero, for dividends on domestic corporations, meaning U.S. corporations, but these lower tax rates on dividends did not apply for investments in foreign corporations. Let's look at the various types of forms of doing business abroad. First is the simplest, and it's the representative office. Here, a company hires a representative agent as an independent contractor. Note that it's an independent contractor and not as a common law or statutory employee. And this independent contractor is charged with soliciting business in the foreign country. Now, banks may use them for soliciting loan accounts. Typically, it's done through industrial sales representatives, where they solicit sales and coordinate orders. They may even administer warranties as well. Now, this is very common with the foreign vendors, manufacturers have these in the U.S. as well. So why would we use this representative office, these agents? It should be tax exempt, meaning the revenues generated from them should may not be taxable in that foreign country. Because there's no due process to tax the activity in the foreign country, in essence. Unless the law is different from what it is in the United States, and it may be, but generally is not, the due process requirements are in effect. And recall that constitutionally, due process requires fairness, and that requires due process will require a nexus with the foreign country, and that physical presence. The second thing, it gives presence in the foreign country. This is when you have agents, you have a presence. It's a low-cost presence, but it's still a presence. Third, it's less expensive than putting a facility in a foreign country. By far, it's less expensive. And last, the foreign country may place harsh limits on foreign investment or ownership interest in foreigners, or high or expensive regulation. In essence, it can be regulatory burdensome, ownership burdensome, and tax burdensome. The second least expensive route is branch operations. This is not a separate entity that's formed in the foreign country because it's operated as a branch. There are potential problems in using them because there are agents, employees of the company, of the foreign company working abroad. Vicarious liability extends to contracts and torts of those agents. There is physical presence to meet due process and in foreign countries. Therefore, there's taxation of the foreign government on the local source income. Now, that's not that foreign taxation, in the foreign country that you're doing business in, does not extend to income other than the revenues or the net income, taxable income generated on that foreign soil. And 3, there may be a loss of tax credits on capital expenditures in a foreign country. Generally, our tax law prefers investment in the United States. This is because jobs are created in the United States. We don't want to give tax credits or give any kind of an incentive for U.S. investment to go abroad. Well, facing these potential problems in using branch operations, why would we use them? Well, first, we may not have any choice because of limitations on foreign investment or foreign ownership. When I was in China in March of 2002, China had just allowed the first U.S. bank. Here they selected Citibank to open up a branch operation in Beijing. You could not own, Americans couldn't own a bank in China. We're allowed to use branch operations. This gives more control by the foreign government. And branch operations provide that middle ground in strategy. It's a next step, commonly after the representative office. And of course, the next step beyond branch operations is a foreign subsidiary, a separate entity. So let's talk about the foreign subsidiaries and joint ventures. Well, for these are new and separate entities to do business in the foreign countries. They are more expensive than representative offices or representative agents and branch offices. The these are wholly owned subsidiaries or joint venture. Now, joint venture is treated similarly to a partnership in terms of business association law. The difference between a joint venture and a partnership per se is that a joint venture, the business is limited into what it's doing. The agency relationship between the venturers, the owners, is limited in the scope of what's being done. You don't expand the scope. It is more, either of these are more costly and time-consuming to form, and the entity itself is subject to regulation by the foreign country. It is not uncommon for closed societies. For example, this was the case from the in 1989, 1990, the fledgling democracies from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc, Poland, for example. They limited the foreign and direct investment to joint ventures. I mean, you could not have a foreign subsidiary. You couldn't buy another company in Poland. And the requirement in Poland at that time, again, because it's a very closed society and economy, is that the foreign direct investor had to enter into a joint venture with a Polish company, and the Polish company had to have control. Now, let's talk about how foreign governments regulate foreign direct investment and why it's necessary. It's important for foreign governments, especially poor foreign governments, in developing countries to get new investment, because this new investment builds up the foreign country. It provides money and jobs. Both of those are extremely important. It was extremely important for Poland and Hungary and then Czechoslovakia to become to have the cash or investment in there to build up their economies, because they started from nothing. To give you another example, when Bulgaria, it's in Eastern Europe, when it broke away from the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union fell apart, basically leaving only Russia and a few small countries that were satellites of Russia, Bulgaria lost 90% of its manufacturing because the manufacturing, all of the manufacturing that was done, for the most part, was exported to Russia. And Bulgaria, other than an agrarian society, was manufacturing based. Lost 90%. It devastated the country, but it has moved on. And in fact, within the last couple of years, it has opened a Chinese automobile assembly plant in the northwestern province of the state. There are possible guarantees by the host country to get new foreign direct investment. Well, one of the fears whenever you go into a foreign country that may or may not be friendly is the fear of nationalization. And nationalization is the taking over of the industry by the government. Well, to prevent this risk of nationalization, the foreign country may offer compensation in the event they have to nationalize the foreign-owned enterprise, or if they might have to stop repatriation of the earnings of the foreign-owned enterprise. Number two, you can have you can have an agreement in which the foreign country agrees to allow patriation of the proceeds upon the sale of the enterprise, and repatriation of the profits and dividends. These are guarantees that reduce risk. There may also be guarantees of repatriation of other forms of current income, like royalties or licensing fees, fees for managerial and other services, or repatriation of the principal and interest from loans. These are key agreements that the foreign country, and also key concessions that are made by the foreign country in order to secure foreign direct investment. There may be a non-discrimination treatment. Now keep in mind that this foreign country in which you're opening business may not be a member of the World Trade Organization. Now, if it's a member of the World Trade Organization, then it's going to be required to not discriminate against the foreign country in terms of imports. But what about internally? It becomes more of a problem. Then there's stabilization of taxes and other regulations. The foreign government may move to stabilize the taxes. And then, of course, they can guarantee convertibility of the local currency. All of these reduce the risk of using foreign direct investment. They're sweeteners, so to speak. Well, given all this background, what are the factors that we're going to need to consider, other than our desire, right, and other than the market for manufacturing or selling? Well, there are generally 6 of these factors to consider in making the decision to place foreign direct investment in a foreign country. One of the key provisions is tax incentives. A lot of times, in order to get foreign direct investment, a developing country will offer tax holidays, tax incentives. This was one of the things that Poland did in the winter of 89-90. I think they gave a 10-year tax holiday. Ireland, in order to get U.S. investment, gave tax holidays as well. And hence, Ford Motor Company and other large U.S. companies put manufacturing facilities in Ireland in order to take advantage of the tax incentives. There can be cheap labor, and obviously poor countries with a glut of cheap labor will offer this. Originally, for U.S. companies, China was one of those. You know, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, Japan had the cheap labor. And then when Japan labor inputs started increasing, then there was South Korea and the Philippines and others. And then when South Korea got too expensive, then there was Mexico and China. And now we're looking at Vietnam, Thailand, and others. Labor does not necessarily mean the labor wage rate. It also includes the social taxes that go along with labor cost. Number 3 are raw materials. Sometimes you have to go to the raw materials because of the prohibitive transportation cost of the raw materials. Number 4, you look for stable and predictable business environment. This looks at are you going to be able to hire the people? Are they going to go on strike? Are there going to be labor stoppages or labor shortages or something of this nature? You look at stability. Then the adequate infrastructure. There are some countries and almost some continents in which the infrastructure is so poor that manufacturing simply cannot operate there. Africa is probably such a place. China's infrastructure outside of the largest cities was like that 20 years ago. The infrastructure has to deal with roads, it has to deal with access in planes and trains, has to deal with electricity and telecommunications. If you consider all of those things, you can see why there's very little foreign direct investment in to the African countries. In fact, in spite of cheap labor, you would think that the African countries, the sub-Saharan African countries, would have such an abundance of cheap labor that the clothing industry, the textile industry, would necessarily move there. Right? Moving out of China, moving out of the Philippines, and then moving out of India, and then just by the nature of it, move into these African countries. But the problem is the other factors, including dependable legal systems. All of these are negative factors that prohibit it. The last one is the dependable legal systems. We talked about the application of the rule of law in our very first lecture as to how important it is for investing overseas and for a developing country improving its economy. We said it was absolutely necessary. You have to have assurance that the courts operate, that the government operates as well, that promises and concessions made by the foreign government will truly be given and enforced. The right to sue or to be sued. Foreign governments want foreign direct investments, but sometimes they are so fearful of outsiders coming in and negatively affecting their people and their government that they will put restrictions on foreign investment. And some of these are understandable. The U.S. has had some of these as well. They've backed off some of them. And let's just go through them very briefly. Repatriation of earnings. If you can't get your earnings out of the foreign country, then you've got some real problems. Why would they stop repatriation of earnings? Simply, the foreign country does not want its economy to shrink because you're pulling the profits and the wealth out of the country. Restrictions on who can invest in the country. Does it have to be an individual? Can it be a corporation? Types of entities available for use. We'll talk about some of these entities in a little bit. Foreign control of the entity. I gave you Poland as an example from the winter of 1989 and 1990. These foreign countries, these developing countries, figure that they don't want to lose control, and so if they have a national with ownership, then they would have more control over the foreign investment. There may be a limitation on the amount of investment by foreigners. There may be a limitation on foreign ownership of banks or foreign ownership of media. I believe the U.S. had this problem. There was limitations on the ownership of television stations. There used to be Major League Baseball used to have a prohibition on ownership by foreign entities or persons. I think it seems that the Seattle Mariners of the Major League Baseball was the first Major League Baseball team owned by a foreigner, and that was Sony Corporation. Their foreign ownership of airlines may very well be limited. Foreign ownership of power generation, you can understand how that would certainly be a problem. Ownership of land and taxation of land, the U.S. had this limitation, where they would not allow foreigners to own land in the U.S. Restrictions on arms production. I suppose if this was open, I suppose the Chinese and the Russians would have arms or munitions plants in the U.S. And then, of course, special reporting for securities ownership. Before you go into a foreign country, placing foreign direct investment there, you need to know about these restrictions. Hence, it may be good to hire or consult local lawyer. Some countries screen the foreign investment. They want to know what's coming in, how much is coming in, how it's going to be used. That's understandable to a degree. So there's the issue of who is going to invest and for what purpose and where. Most countries screen foreign investment, but there usually are threshold limits. For example, Africa and Asia screen all foreign investments, or they have very low threshold, where on the other hand, the Netherlands and Belgium have no screening at all. Just bring your money and invest it here. Let's talk about doing business now. Business operations itself. The business operations of foreign direct investment. There are antitrust limitations. Now, we've talked in this class about antitrust laws, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act. The EU has stronger antitrust regulation than does the U.S. And if a U.S. company forms a subsidiary or does business through a branch operations or a joint venture, then they're going to be subject to the antitrust implications, the antitrust laws of the foreign government. Mergers, approval of mergers in the foreign country. We talked about this. By and large, it's fairly easy to combine two companies in the U.S. It seems that ever since the 1980s, the U.S. has been reluctant to limit mergers. Now, sometimes they do, and we've talked about that. But for example, in 2001, General Electric and Honeywell International, these are two U.S. companies. They're two very large companies, especially General Electric. They proposed to merge. The merger passed Federal Trade Commission scrutiny in the U.S., but the European Union rejected the merger because it failed the EU's dominance test. There was too much concern about vertical integration and the conglomerate effects and horizontal overlap. So in essence, these companies provide. Sometimes they manufacture the same products, same goods. Sometimes component parts. One of the two manufactures component parts that are inputs in the other's product, i.e. vertical integration. So we got horizontal integration and vertical integration. And the EU regulators thought that it was simply too much dominance. It would create too much dominance, too much of a big thing. So even though this was a $45 billion merger in 2001, these two companies could not combine because of the fear of being frozen out of the European marketplace. Because if they merged and they were a monopoly, then the European governments could refuse to allow them to operate, and that would simply be too much revenue to give up. So they called off the merger. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the proposed merger of DuPont and Dow Chemical will be viewed the same way by the European antitrust regulators. Let's look at employee relationship and protection of employees in these foreign countries. Well, we have to consider the wage input themselves. How much is it going to cost? Is it going to be is it a low wage input? Are there higher social costs, social taxes? You know, not all foreign countries that are developing countries have the same labor input. For example, if you were investing in Bulgaria or Romania, these would have higher social costs, social taxes, Social Security, for example, and higher inputs, labor inputs in terms of wages than, say, investment in Bangladesh or Vietnam. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, we mentioned it in securities regulation, Section 307 to be specific, prohibits importation of products made in whole or in part with the use of convict, forced, or indentured labor under penal sanctions, and including the goods produced through forced or indentured child labor. These products can be seized by U.S. Customs. So, simply wouldn't be able to export them back into the U.S. It is important to note that the employment laws of the EU are not uniform. The notion of the European Union is that they issue the members of the European Union offer directives, and these directives are to the member countries, and it says this is what we would like you to do. And it's up to the individual members of the EU to decide whether or not they want to comply with the directive or go off on their own in terms of a different law. So employment laws are not the same. The labor unions in the EU and elsewhere are more powerful, except for China, of course, is more powerful than they are in the U.S. Of course, in China, labor unions are, we're going to designate a labor union, but we're not going to, the government controls them anyway, so they have no teeth. But the labor unions in the EU are more powerful, and you have to deal with it. There are restrictions, or maybe restrictions, on the termination of employees. And again, we'll look at the European Union. The European Union gives a lot more power to labor unions and give a lot more power legislatively to workers. It's much more difficult to terminate workers in the European Union than it is in the U.S. Even though, most of the states in the U.S. Are not employment at will states, there are some limitations. The implicit contract doctrine is dominant in the U.S. But the EU, even outside of unions, give protection to workers. Let's take Germany, for example. Their Protection Against Dismissal Act. It applies to employers of 5 or more employees. These are mom and pop organizations that have limitations placed on them on firing workers. In Germany, an employee has 6 months probationary work period, meaning during this period, the workers are terminable at will. By the way, other countries in the EU have the same thing. France, for example. France wanted, during the Sarkozy administration, when he was president, wanted to improve the French economy to make it more competitive. And so one of the things that this more conservative French president requested was a change in the statutory provision on this probationary period. He wanted to extend it, I think, from 6 months to 9 months, or 6 months to a year, something of this nature. And the workers, and it would affect younger workers. And the people rose up and they marched in the street against him. And it eventually failed. He was not able to change the law to extend this terminal at will for probationary work period. And I believe he was a one-term French president. Now back to Germany. So the Germans have a 6 months probationary period where the new worker is terminal at will. After that, the employee can be terminated only based on 1, incompetence, meaning they can't do the work, 2, inappropriate conduct, and this is what you would typically find, sex discrimination, drug use, intoxication, fighting, etc. Or number 3, redundancy. And redundancy is a unique term. It sounds so British. But redundancy means you don't need this worker anymore, right? You already have somebody to do this work. You got too many people to do this work, and therefore you have to let 1 or more go. You have to lay them off because we don't have work for them to do. So you can see how these are very limited situations of what you can do. with workers once they hit that 6-month probationary period. Hence, the cost of doing business in terms of labor inputs in Germany is much higher. Well, let's continue on with the discussion of redundancy in Germany. We talked about that redundancy is not like the U.S. layoff. Mergers don't qualify for redundancy. If you dig yourself a hole by merging into the company, now, in the U.S., this is one of the ways of creating efficiency. You merge two companies and you lay off the people who are no longer necessary, and this is especially in the case of administration. The burden of proof is on the employer here. And so, before you get into the layoff stage for redundancy, certain policies have to be in place, and there are certain limitations as to what's done. For example, before a German company can decide through redundancy it has too many workers and start laying off workers, they must stop overtime first and reduce hours. Now, this would cause problems in the United States. If a worker is generally used to working 5 to 10 hours of overtime a week, that worker would not be allowed to do that, and that would make the workers who generally would stay, that would make them unhappy. A German, before there can be a layoff, the German company employer has to prove that the position is not needed. Again, the burden of proof is on the German employer. And finally, and this is completely contrary to U.S. policy and Title VII, you have to apply social criteria for redundancy. And this requires a consideration of the least harm to the employee. Look at as another example. If you have two workers, you have a man and a woman, and let's suppose they've both been working there at the same time. Let's suppose that the woman is married and she has no child. Her husband is working, and she's working, but she's under consideration for layoff because of redundancy. And let's suppose that the male employee is married, but his wife is not working, and let's suppose he has 2 children. The social considerations under the German employment law would require that the female, in this particular case, be targeted for redundancy and laid off, and the male employee would continue work. You can see how this would violate Title VII because it would be a decision clearly based on gender, or it would be sex plus discrimination, sex discrimination. Also looking at Germany, because Germany is reflective of other countries. For example, Bulgaria certainly is no Germany in terms of its economy, but it follows similar employment laws like this. The German Work Constitution Act. I want you to keep in mind what Volkswagen USA and the Chattanooga, Tennessee Volkswagen assembly plant, what they are fearful of by allowing a union to represent workers in Chattanooga, at the Chattanooga plant. All right, so the Germany Work Constitution Act, employers of 5 or more employees, and this again, these are small employers. These are mom and pop employers. These covered employers must have work councils. A work council means the employee has representation on the board of directors. They have a right of co-determination with management of personnel decisions. social affairs, and the right to be informed on business operations. In essence, they have a seat on the board of directors. This right to be informed, meaning they have input. If, for German companies of 100 or more employees, employers must have an economic council added. This would be the case. And this is what Volkswagen USA at its Chattanooga plant. This is what they want. They want to bring this to the U.S. 100 or more employees, employers must have an economic council added. And if there are 500 or more employees, and this would be probably the Chattanooga plant, then 1/3 of the supervisory board of directors of public or private companies must be composed of employee representatives. You can see how this input slows things down. Now, I mean, it does offer greater protection to employees and workers. That's no doubt about that. It increases the cost of doing business. It increases the complexity of doing business, the complexity of management. It increases the risk of lawsuits. But I must say, Germany's economy has been strong for a very long time, and it, by and large, is the best in all of Europe. All right, the last thing that we're going to look at are the forms of doing business, the forms of the entities, business associations. And I don't want to get into the weeds on these. Some of them you're familiar with, others are new. The public stock companies, this would typically be, Siemens, AG, something like that. ABB, for example. There can be private limited liability corporation. Now, these are not like U.S. LLCs. There be general partnerships that you know about, limited partnerships that we talked about, and limited partnerships with shares, kind of a variation of the limited partnerships. But the newest form, it's been around since 2004, the one that's sanctioned by the EU and is applicable to the European Union on the whole, and in fact it's the purpose, is the Societas Europea. This is a new form of a limited liability company in the EU that requires the legislative components to be met, and you have to do business a certain way. It has to be managed a certain way, and if it is done, if you meet the requirements for the statute, then you can avoid a lot of the transparency issues, a lot of the municipal law issues where one member of the EU has a different law on business associations than does another. It will operate, can operate in all of the EU member states, all 25 or 26 of them, and there would be compliance with the business association law, the LLC law, in all of them. In essence, it gives a uniform set of rules for this type of business entity. There's less risk of failure of a business entity because of non-compliance administratively. Creates this uniformity, for management and so forth, and it can be share ownership. there is a minimum capital requirement. It's a small minimum capital requirement of only 120,000 euros, and a euro is the equivalent of about $1.30. So, what, 150,000 US dollars, 160,000 US dollars. No, I take that back. 130 and a third of, yeah, okay, about that. Not a lot. There's not a whole lot of money involved to create one. The registered office of the Societas Europea must be in an EU member state. It can be created through merger between a parent and a subsidiary. It can be a holding company and a subsidiary. And it gives the ability to reorganize the company as well. So this ends the lecture on doing business globally from a foreign direct investment perspective. This is the last of the lecture videos for this course, and I hope you've found them helpful. The material that's been given in all of these lecture videos are material that I would have discussed in my face-to-face class, probably more. And with that, we end the video. Don't tell me we did that. You unplugged me? No. No. Kidding me. You're kidding me.